There are relics in American churches that should not exist. They sit behind locked glass in forgotten sanctuaries, said to carry the blessings of long-dead saints. But the truth of their origin is something far more disturbing. Something carved from silence and sealed with blood. In the rural hills of Pennsylvania in the years before the American Revolution, there was a family whose craftsmanship adorned altars across the colonies. Chalices, crucifixes, reliquaries, holy vessels etched with divine beauty, created not for praise but concealment. Their name was Whitmore, and behind their pious reputation hid a centuries-old secret so horrific it had to be erased from history. Nathaniel Whitmore arrived in the colonies in 1742, a quiet English craftsman who spoke little but watched much. He bought 12 acres of dense forest west of Philadelphia and built a workshop of timber and glass, large enough to catch the light, private enough to bury the truth. To the world, he was a maker of sacred things. To his family, he was a prophet, a man who believed that God had revealed to him a way to sanctify America, not through sermons, but through relics, real ones, flesh and bone, venerated not for their holiness, but for how convincingly they mimicked it. They began with Mary Collins, a Quaker healer beloved by the poor. She vanished in November of 1745 during a snowstorm, last seen walking past the Whitmore land. Her disappearance caused only mild concern. Wolves, natives, winter, any of them made convenient scapegoats. But hidden in a prison wall in Philadelphia, decades later, a deathbed confession was discovered. Thomas Whitmore, Nathaniel's son, had written every word in a shaking hand. Father said her saintliness made her perfect, he confessed. He told us God required sacrifice to make sacred what the church lacked. And so they took her, lured her into the woods with cries of a missing child, led her into the rear room of the workshop, where velvet-lined tables had already been prepared, where ritual and industry became one. The Whitmores processed her body for 3 days. Tissue was cured with salt and herbs, bones cleaned and polished, fragments sewn into embroidered velvet pouches marked with symbols of light. Then Nathaniel traveled to Philadelphia with 3 carved boxes. He returned with gold and orders. At Mary's memorial, he gifted the congregation a new altar. They didn't know what was sealed inside. Beneath layers of cedar and gold leaf lay a single fragment of her spine, now called holy by the same hands that severed it. That altar still stands, a sacred relic containing the desecrated remains of a woman once revered, now hidden behind a sermon. You were never supposed to hear this. That's the truth. You were meant to kneel before artifacts of power, never questioning what made them sacred. But now you're beginning to understand. Some relics are not discovered. They're manufactured. The Whitmores didn't just carve wood, they carved narratives, false holiness, and false history. And with every sale, they embedded their deception deeper into the American church. And that deception? It's still there. By 1750, the Whitmore name had become synonymous with spiritual craftsmanship. Churches across Pennsylvania, New Jersey, even parts of Maryland displayed their creations with pride. Chalices kissed by parishioners, reliquaries paraded on feast days. But no one asked the question that mattered. Where did the relics come from? The Protestant church had no relic tradition. The colonies had no ancient saints. And yet Whitmore relics continued to appear, always with a backstory, always with a miracle. A mother cured of fever, a boy healed of blindness, all attributed to fragments of saints the Whitmores claimed to have acquired from Europe. But there were no import records, no verified sources, only the charisma of Nathaniel and the persuasive aura of the objects themselves. Behind closed doors, the Whitmore family evolved from artisans into engineers of myth. Elizabeth, Nathaniel's wife, refined the process. She believed that certain souls, especially those marked by purity, piety, or spiritual anguish, could produce more potent relics. She called it discernment. According to Sarah Whitmore's journal, her mother could sense whose bodies would hold the light best. Those chosen were not kidnapped by violence. They were lured by kindness, invited into the Whitmore home for prayer, for healing, for guidance. They were fed, bathed, comforted, then silenced forever beneath the workshop floor. The cellar beneath the workshop was no longer a simple storage space. It had been transformed into what Thomas called a cathedral of sacrifice. The air smelled of copper and incense. Tables lined the walls, stained dark and wiped clean. Pulleys and hooks hung from the beams. The family wore aprons stitched with biblical verses. They believed they were doing holy work. They believed they were saving the colonies from spiritual decay. And their belief, however twisted, was contagious. Ministers who received the relics reported bursts of revival. Churches once empty now overflowed with weeping congregants, speaking in tongues, trembling before altars that dripped with the illusion of power. They didn't know that the finger bone they wept over once belonged to a man named Peter Holt, a preacher who vanished near the Whitmore land in 1751. Or that the desiccated heart that drew hundreds to a Virginia church once beat inside a 12-year-old girl named Annabelle Cross, who disappeared from a Quaker school in Delaware. You see, power has always fed on silence, and the Whitmores understood that better than any institution in early America. They didn't just sell relics, they sold authority. They sold the illusion that churches in the New World were just as sacred as Rome, just as touched by the divine. Ministers who questioned the origins were told to have faith. Those who pushed harder disappeared. This is the point where most men look away. This is where belief becomes complicity. But if you've made it this far, I'll ask you not to flinch. Instead, write this in the comments to seal your place in the circle. Sacred flesh, hidden truth. Write it twice. Once to mark your awakening. Again to lock the truth inside you. Because the rabbit hole only gets deeper from here, and the Whitmore legacy is far from over. By the mid-1760s, the Whitmore family was no longer simply crafting relics. They were crafting narratives, stories that fed the hunger of a new American faith. Protestant ministers, desperate to elevate their status in a culture torn between reason and revelation, found in the Whitmores a pipeline to credibility. Each relic came with a forged history written in the same elegant script Elizabeth had once used for biblical engravings. These accounts spoke of unnamed saints from obscure villages in Saxony, martyrs executed under imaginary tyrants, or anonymous visionaries whose final words were conveniently lost to time. These fictions were rarely challenged. After all, what man of God would question a miracle that filled pews and collection plates? It wasn't just the ministers who were seduced. Communities began to reshape themselves around these objects. Parents brought sick children to touch the boxes. Soldiers carried fragments into battle, believing they were protected. A generation was raised under relics made from murdered bodies. And still, no one spoke. No one dared. The Whitmores had embedded themselves too deeply. Nathaniel had friends in city councils. Elizabeth taught scripture to the daughters of judges. Sarah's financial acumen bought silence from creditors and competitors alike. And William had become something else entirely. Of all the Whitmore children, it was William whose transformation was most profound. Withdrawn as a boy, cold as a young man, he now saw himself not as a craftsman, but as a priest of blood. He began to develop new theories, twisted doctrines about spiritual resonance and bodily purity. He claimed that certain body parts produced stronger relics depending on the virtue of the victim, the heart for faith, the eyes for prophecy, the hands for healing, and the tongue for obedience. He wrote these theories in journals wrapped in leather, stored in secret drawers, scrawled in code and old Latin phrases. His siblings found it disturbing. His father found it divine. By 1770, the family's cellar had been expanded again, this time with assistance from hired masons who were paid not in coin, but in gold crosses, relics, and silence. A second underground chamber was created, accessible only by a trapdoor beneath the hearth. Here, the remains were sorted. Bones bleached and carved, organs salted and sealed, hair woven into prayer ropes. Every part had a purpose. Nothing was wasted. But power never expands without cost. With greater demand came risk. In 1772, a young apprentice named Caleb Dunn overheard a conversation between William and Sarah. He fled into the woods. His body was found weeks later in a shallow creek, throat cut, tongue removed. The coroner called it an animal attack. The town forgot him within days. But the Whitmores didn't. From then on, apprentices were rotated out every 6 months, their memories softened with wine and holy fear. Outside, the colonies marched toward revolution. Inside the Whitmore home, the rituals grew darker. Victims were no longer just chosen for purity. They were chosen for symbolism. A mute boy to represent silent faith. A blind woman to embody divine vision. A burned soldier to signify holy sacrifice. These weren't just murders. They were sermons. The family believed America was being reborn, and they would be its secret saints. They weren't building a business. They were building a theology, a faith rooted in flesh, in fear, in unspoken power, and beneath every church that held their relics, that power pulsed. In the winter of 1786, something shifted. For nearly 4 decades, the Whitmores had operated with chilling precision, selecting victims, preserving remains, and distributing relics across a growing nation. But rot spreads fastest from within. William's doctrines had begun to mutate into something grotesque. He no longer referred to their victims as saints. He called them vessels, carriers of divine current. He spoke of resonance chambers, special compartments constructed beneath certain churches where relics were to be placed for maximum influence. The body is an antenna, he wrote, and pain is the amplifier. This ideology unsettled even his sister Mary, who had once helped prepare relics with silent resolve. She wrote in a hidden letter discovered 2 centuries later, "William has lost himself. Father obeys, mother prays, but none of us dare confront him. He says the relics whisper now, that he dreams in voices not his own." At the same time, Daniel Foster, the apprentice who had been shown glimpses of the truth, began keeping his own record. He was no fool. He understood the danger, but what he saw beneath that house, in the second chamber where relics were refined, haunted him. He wrote in cipher, hiding pages beneath loose stones in the workshop. His entries became more urgent, more desperate. "They believe they are priests. I believe they are mad, but I stay, for now." The family expanded again. This time, not the cellar, but the ideology. Nathaniel began writing letters to church leaders proposing the formal canonization of certain New World saints, an anonymous group of colonial martyrs whose relics, he claimed, had produced documented miracles. These weren't just sales pitches, they were attempts to reshape American Protestantism from within, to root it in physicality, not doctrine, to bind it to objects no different from the Catholic saints they once disavowed, only darker, secret, blood-born. One of these churches was St. Ambrose in Maryland, where a pastor named John Hale received a relic said to contain the bone of a child martyred by native raiders. The artifact drew hundreds. Miracles were claimed. But Pastor Hale, a former physician, began to question the relic's legitimacy. He scraped the bone, tested it with crude reagents, and determined it was no older than 20 years. He sent a discreet inquiry to Philadelphia, where he believed the relic originated. Within 3 weeks, his church caught fire. Hale escaped. Most of his congregation did not. By 1788, the Whitmore family was operating more like a cult than a business. William conducted nighttime rituals in the woods, robes dyed in ash and ochre, relics buried beneath oak trees while prayers were whispered in twisted Latin. Thomas grew withdrawn. Sarah drank heavily. Elizabeth took to quoting scripture out of context, muttering of a holy kingdom hidden in sinew. And Nathaniel, once a craftsman, now a prophet in his own mind, spoke openly of establishing a cathedral of flesh where all true relics would one day be returned. This is where their theology began to turn apocalyptic. They no longer saw the relics as tools of influence. They saw them as seeds, vessels of awakening meant to trigger something in the hearts of those who touched them. "When the time comes," William wrote, "the saints will call to one another. They will sing through the blood, and the faithful will follow." At this point in the video, speak directly to the viewer. If you've come this far, you're not just curious. You've already stepped into something deeper. The Whitmore story isn't just history, it's architecture. Foundations laid in silence beneath churches that still stand. If you understand what's being revealed, comment the phrase, "I hear the saints," twice, once for yours, elf, and once for the hidden eyes watching. Let the algorithm know you're one of the few who see beneath the surface. The collapse came, as it always does, not from the outside, but from the fracture of belief within. It was Thomas who broke. In August of 1789, he fled the Whitmore estate under cover of night, taking with him a sealed box and 3 letters, one to the Philadelphia Historical Society, one to a Quaker elder named Elijah Thompson, and one to a young Presbyterian minister he had once called friend. Inside the box were 2 relics, finger bones wrapped in silk, and a journal confessing to over 4 decades of systematic murder and desecration. His final words, written in blood at the end of that book: "There is no sanctity in what we did, only silence, and that silence devours." Thompson, the Quaker minister, acted swiftly. He formed a private council of church leaders, men bound by secrecy who feared the exposure would collapse trust in the church as a whole. They agreed to investigate quietly, lest public scandal tear apart the fragile spiritual fabric of the young republic. By winter, Thompson himself visited the Whitmore estate under the pretense of commissioning a relic altar. What he saw disturbed him beyond words. The unnatural stillness of the household, the heavy air scented with herbs and something metallic, the glassy stares of Elizabeth and William, and the peculiar hum from beneath the floorboards, like a choir heard underwater. He never returned home. In February 1790, a fire engulfed the Whitmore estate. Witnesses from a neighboring farm saw flames rise at midnight, but no cries for help, only shadows moving within the blaze, as if performing some final rite. When the authorities arrived, the house was ash. Of the Whitmore family, only one body was recovered, Sarah's, half-burned, a crucifix fused into her palm. No remains were ever confirmed for William, Thomas, Nathaniel, or Elizabeth. Some say they died in that fire. Others believe they fled, taking their secrets elsewhere, perhaps to another church, another state. But one thing was certain: the relic trade did not stop. In the decades that followed, new rumors emerged. A silent order of relic artisans appeared briefly in Virginia, then vanished. A series of churches in Ohio reported unexplained healings, each linked to altars crafted in an identical style. And in 1832, during the restoration of a church in Kentucky, a sealed compartment was discovered beneath the pulpit. Inside were relics, real ones, and a letter bearing the Whitmore seal. It ended with the line, "The saints are never silent, they merely wait to be heard again." That's why this story matters, because the Whitmores were never just one family. They were the prototype for something older than America, older than the church. A blueprint of spiritual control, where faith is harvested, not offered, where worship is shaped by what lies beneath, not above, and where institutions meant to save may be built upon sanctified flesh. This isn't just dark history, it's a reminder. That relic on display in your local church, that venerated object behind locked glass, ask where it came from, ask what it cost. And if no one answers, remember this: silence is not the absence of truth, it's the evidence of it. And now, if you feel the weight of what's been shared, if something in you has shifted, then you're not just a viewer. You're part of the remembering. Like, share, subscribe. Because stories like these aren't supposed to survive, but with you they do. Speak their name, and remember, not all saints rest in peace.